Utter chaos erupting in Atlanta. This is the aftermath from rioting over the weekend. Look at this. Windows of businesses smashed. A police car was set on fire during all this. Today, 6 people are under arrest in what activists called a night of rage. It was in response to the death of Manuel Tehran last week. Tehran was shot and killed by a police officer after they say he shot a state trooper. Tehran was among a group of protesters who have been occupying a site planned for police training center in the Atlanta area. Tracking the very latest now, correspondent Carolyn Ryan, who joins us live from Atlanta. Carolyn, good to see you. I guess there's been 6 arrests. What can you tell us about these suspects?
Good afternoon, Bianca. Yes, 6 individuals face multiple charges, including domestic terrorism and rioting. Now, police and far-left protesters have been clashing for over a year now over this police training facility the city wants to build, but it really hit a climax on Saturday with a violent anti-police riot in downtown Atlanta. So here's the backstory. The protesters set up a self-proclaimed autonomous zone in the forest that surrounds the property. They illegally occupied the area, living in tree houses and camping out in tents. And they do everything they can to stop construction on the 85-acre police training facility that they have nicknamed Cop City. They've set fires, destroyed property, thrown rocks and Molotov cocktails at police and firefighters, and really terrorized construction workers and their families. Now, authorities have routinely gone in to try to clear out these camps, and that's what they were doing Wednesday of last week. The Georgia State Patrol, along with other agencies, were conducting a clearing operation when they say one of the activists, you see him on your screen there, 26-year-old Manuel Tehran, shot and wounded one of the state troopers. The GBI says the officers returned fire, killing him. Now, fellow protesters responded by organizing what they call a night of rage. They are demanding an investigation. Hundreds took to the streets of downtown Atlanta Saturday night for a protest seeking justice for Tehran. Now, many of them were dressed all in black with their faces covered. It quickly turned violent. Rioters armed with explosives broke windows, attacked police cars, and set at least one police cruiser on fire. Of the 6 arrested, only one of them is from Georgia. All the others traveled here from out of state. Now, Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene and other law enforcement sources say these radicals are affiliated with Antifa and BLM. Now, Andre Dickens, Atlanta's Democrat mayor, who also supports the training facility, he appeared on CBS Face the Nation on Sunday, but he refused to label these terrorists. Take a listen.
I don't get into the names. I don't know all the organizations. I'll let y'all decide who did it. I just know they're arrested. And if they come into Atlanta again to wreak havoc, they will be arrested again.
Now, the anti-police activists who claim that they're just trying to defend the forest area that surrounds that police training center, they do have a national network supporting them. The group has a very active Twitter page under the name Defend the Atlanta Forest. And there are multiple tweets on their page from other activist and Antifa groups from around the country that are expressing solidarity with the far-left extremists here in Atlanta. Now, some have even indicated that they're organizing their own vigils and protests for that activist that was shot and killed last week in their own states in the days ahead. So that is certainly something that authorities both here in Georgia and all across the country are going to keep a very close eye on in case any further violence erupts. That's the latest here in Atlanta. Bianca, I'll throw it back to you.
As they should, and only one from Georgia. Interesting note there. Carolyn Ryan, appreciate the update. Keep us posted on what happens later today.
All right, well, burning cars, extensive property damage, violent Antifa activists imported from out of town, terrorism charges. These are all the hallmarks of what some people who work in news call mostly peaceful protests. The latest example comes to us from Atlanta.
That vehicle still up in flames here over at Andrew Young and Peachtree. And if you take a look over here, if you pan over, I want to show you. This is what they were handing out at that protest. So it was a largely peaceful protest.
A largely peaceful protest. Yes, it's happened again. The largely peaceful protest in Atlanta, while not as costly, looks a lot like the fiery but mostly peaceful protest we saw in Kenosha, Wisconsin, live on CNN during the summer of 2020. The Kenosha unrest caused an estimated $50 million in property damage. Nothing says mostly peaceful like $50 million in property damage. Before that, we also had MSNBC's Ari Velshi denying that the George Floyd protests in Minneapolis were unruly, even as fire was raging right behind him.
I want to be clear in how I characterize this. This is mostly a protest. It is not, generally speaking, unruly, but fires have been started.
Yes, fires were started. The other problem with a lot of the media downplaying the violence from the left is that so many of them focus almost solely on extremist threats from the right. Take this article, the recent one here from the Council on Foreign Relations, for example. The headline reads, "The violent far-right terrorist threat to the Republican Party and American conservatism." The article does mention the shooting of Congressman Steve Scalise and the recent assassination attempt on Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, but the author dismisses these as minor incidents compared to the threats we see from the right. And that happens all the time. To a lot of the press, one kind of violence is okay, the other is not. And that's probably why you will not hear much about this next story from the establishment press either. Riley Dowell, the 23-year-old daughter of House Democratic Whip Catherine Clark, who is the second highest ranking Democrat in the House, was arrested this weekend in Boston during an anti-police protest there. She's facing charges for assaulting a police officer and spray painting a monument. Witnesses say the officer was hit in the face with something and could be seen bleeding from his nose and his mouth. Police also say Riley Dowell spray painted "No Cop City" and ACAB on the monument. ACAB is an anti-police acronym used by violent left-wing activists. It stands for All Cops Are Bastards. The protest followed a fatal police shooting earlier this month in Cambridge, which is, of course, near Boston. The suspect who was shot and killed had advanced on some officers with some type of sword. A less than lethal sponge round had failed to stop him, according to local news reports and the police. Now, Congresswoman Clark tweeted this after her daughter's arrest: "I love Riley, and this is a very difficult time in the cycle of joy and pain in parenting. This will be evaluated by the legal system, and I am confident in that process." All right, let's bring in our panel now to talk more about all this. Welcome in Isabel Brown from Turning Point USA. Also with us, Ari Hoffman, radio host and West Coast editor for the Post Millennial. Ari, I'll throw it to you first on this one. As a parent, you feel for Congresswoman Clark, but again, you look at the way large chunks of the media and the political left talk about police. It's not hard to imagine where a 23-year-old would get these kind of ideas. And obviously, she's not oppressed. Her mom is the House Democratic Whip, so she's in a powerful position. What do you make of the arrest in Boston and all this violence?
It reminds me a lot of the arrest in Seattle that people seem to have forgotten about, where the stepson of a political official here, a Democrat political official, was charged and eventually sentenced for hitting a police officer in the head with a metal baseball bat during the riots in 2020. I mean, I wasn't ready for riot season yet, John. I still had my COVID decorations up. But this is the exact same stuff we saw happening in Seattle in 2020, where they were saying fiery but mostly peaceful, that they were saying, oh, no, it's just a protest. Meanwhile, you had an autonomous zone filled with 6 blocks of armed Antifa activists, armed BLM activists. And this thing in Atlanta, this area in the forest near where they're building this police facility, this has been going on for over a year. Our autonomous zone only lasted 3 weeks. And I say only, who could believe something like that could happen? And yet you are now looking at millions of dollars in lawsuits that are going on. We just found out on Friday that the mayor and other city officials had deliberately deleted their text messages so nobody could see what they were actually up to when they were providing the rioters with hygiene facilities, barriers, you name it, whatever they wanted so they could occupy Seattle. And now a federal judge has sanctioned the city and said that going forward in the trial, the jury can consider the fact that they deliberately deleted these text messages.
Aside from the text message a little before Saul Alinsky's time, but this is all out of the Rules for Radicals playbook. And also listen to, we got to talk more about the media, Isabel. Listen to how one guest on CNN suggested using the word violent in association with the Atlanta protests might not be a good idea.
You keep using these words, violent, and it gives the impression, I mean, the only violence or the only acts of violence against people that I saw were actually police tackling protesters.
You know, I did read this in a few other reports that the violence was like contained to one area. But then, Isabel, you read about shop owners that had to close up for the day and people who missed out on wages at a CVS store. I read one local report about a guy who worked at CVS and they had to shut down. I mean, that's a form of violence to them. That's taking money out of their pockets. And, you know, whether it's this block or multiple blocks, it's not good for Atlanta. It's not a good look.
It's not. And the really sad reality, John, is that really since 2020 and the summer of peaceful protests, aka riots that rocked the nation, America has been living in the upside down. Up is down and down is up and right is left and left is right and men are women and women are men. And all of a sudden violence is peace, but peace is actually violence because we need to be standing up for those oppressed by the police. The reality is the media is intentionally covering up the individual who shot first violently at police officers and then unfortunately lost their life to justify lighting entire cities, this time Atlanta, on fire. And the media is much more focused on getting the gender identity of Representative Clark's son, then turned non-binary, now turned daughter, right, in all of the news reporting, but refuse to condemn this for what it is: illegal, unconscionable, and violent. They will jump to any extreme necessary to call you a violent extremist or a domestic terrorist if you happen to disagree with what's being said on Capitol Hill or what's trending on social media, but they refuse to call this terrorism, which is disgusting and frankly inexcusable moving into 2023 America.
Yeah, and they all have the talking point, mostly peaceful. I mean, come on, what journalist is going to say, here's a car on fire, it's most pan over here, though, it's mostly peaceful. You know, the one thing that struck me is look at the folks who were arrested. They're facing federal charges. All they were doing was praying outside an abortion clinic. I think we have that video. That was last March. These people are now this looks like a mostly peaceful protest to me, but they're pro-life. Oh, wow, let's throw it. They're facing federal charges under the FACE Act, but you have BLM and you have the Summer of Love and we have Kamala Harris bailing out protesters, Ari. People need to wake up and say, you know, this is outrageous when you have people like this who are simply, they're not even blocking the door. Come on, how are they going to have to fight a federal charge?
Right, and what you see happening with Antifa and BLM, I'll call it that, what you see happening is the same thing that happened in 2020. You have a few people in each city, but then you have people that come from outside the city to join them. During the autonomous zone, during the riots in Seattle in 2020, you had all these people coming in from out of town. In fact, we had a candidate who ran for Seattle city attorney who wanted to set up a staging area between Seattle and Portland so that activists would have a place to keep their stuff and stage between moving from one city to another because they were traveling all over the country. This is a terrorist
enabling them.
Yeah, this is a terrorist organization. Nobody wants to do anything about it.
All right, Isabel and Ari, come back, guys. We got more to talk about with you in the next hour.